I refused to give my parents their first grandchild after they disowned me. When I was 19, I got pregnant by my then boyfriend. My parents, who were extremely conservative, went crazy. They told me I had ruined my future, called me irresponsible, and gave me an ultimatum. Either I gave the baby up for adoption or they would cut me off completely. I refused to give up my child, so they followed through on their threat. No financial support, no contact, nothing. It was tough, but I made it. I finished college, built a career, and raised my son, now 7 years old, without them. They never reached out, not even when they knew where I was. Fast forward to now. My younger sister, 24 years old, just had her first baby, and suddenly my parents are obsessed with being grandparents. They threw a huge welcome party for the baby, constantly post about being first-time grandparents, and act as if my son doesn't exist. It hurt, but I let it go. But then, out of nowhere, they reached out to me, saying they wanted to reconnect because my son is actually their first grandchild, and they feel guilty for missing out on his life. They even had the audacity to say that my son deserves to know his real family. I told them absolutely not. They made their choice 7 years ago, and I'm not going to let them come back into my son's life just because they suddenly care about being grandparents. They got angry and said I was being cruel and selfish for punishing them for past mistakes. My sister says I should at least consider it for my son's sake, but I don't think I owe them anything. Since that conversation, my parents have intensified their attempts to contact me. They've been messaging me almost every day, trying to appeal to my emotions. At first, it was generic apologies, telling me they were wrong and deeply regretted how they treated me. Then, they started insisting that they had changed, that they now understood what it meant to be parents and grandparents, and that time had made them reflect. They said they wanted to meet their grandson, be part of his life, and give him the love they couldn't give him in his childhood. But I can't forget the pain of those early years. I can't forget how they left me alone when I needed them the most. Raising a child while young and without support was an enormous challenge, and even though I'm stable now, there were nights when I cried myself to sleep from exhaustion, nights when I wondered if I could keep going. My parents weren't there to help me through those hard times, and now, all of a sudden, they expect me to let them in just because it's convenient for them. My sister keeps insisting that I should give them a chance. She tells me that people change, that everyone makes mistakes, and that my son would benefit from having more family in his life. But what she doesn't understand is that this isn't just about me. It's not just about the past. It's about my son and protecting him from people who ignored him for 7 years, people who could hurt him the same way they hurt me. Still, a part of me doubts. Not because I believe my parents have truly changed, but because I fear that one day my son will ask why I didn't let him meet them. Will he resent me in the future for making this decision for him? Will he think I was too harsh, that I should have given them a chance? I don't want him to suffer from the absence of grandparents if he ever feels like something is missing. As I deal with these doubts, my parents keep sending messages. They've even tried to contact my son directly through social media, which terrifies me. I don't want them to manipulate him, to tell him that his mother is the one keeping him from knowing them. How do I explain to a 7-year-old the complexity of this situation without making him feel trapped in a conflict that shouldn't be his? Things took an even more intense turn when, a few days ago, my mother showed up at my son's school. A friend who works there called me to let me know she saw her trying to talk to him. Fortunately, a teacher intervened and didn't allow her to get close. But the fact that she went that far left me in shock. What are they willing to do to get what they want? Where is the limit? After this incident, I was forced to take action. I contacted a lawyer to find out what I could do legally to protect my son from any unwanted contact. I also blocked my parents from all my social media and reinforced security at the school to make sure they couldn't try again. But this isn't over. I know they won't give up so easily. And while I am determined to protect my son, I wonder what will come next. How far are they willing to go? And most importantly, how will I handle all of this without it affecting my son in the process? After reinforcing security at the school and blocking any contact with my parents, I thought I would at least get a break, but I was wrong. A few days later, I received an email from an unknown address. As I opened it, a chill ran down my spine. It was my mother. "We don't want conflict. We just want to see our grandson. We understand that you're angry, that you feel hurt, but it's unfair for you to deny us the chance to make amends for our mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. Haven't you ever made one? We're not asking you to forgive us immediately, just for a chance to show that we have changed." The message continued with pleas and promises of remorse, but all I could feel was anger. Make amends for their mistakes? There's no way to give me back the years of loneliness, the suffering of raising my child without support. They can't undo the pain they caused with a simple, "we're sorry." But what worried me the most was what this meant. They had found another way to contact me. I made sure to block the email address, but now paranoia was creeping in. How did they get it? Who else was giving them information about me? I knew my sister was in contact with them, and even though I didn't want to think badly of her, I couldn't help but wonder if she had given them my email. I decided to call her. "Do you know anything about this?" I asked bluntly when she answered. "About what?" She replied nervously. "My parents sent me an email. Someone had to give them my address." My sister was silent for a few seconds before sighing. "Look, I don't know how they got your email, but is it really that bad that they're trying to contact you? I told you before, people change. You can't keep hating them forever." "I don't hate them," I replied firmly. "I just keep them out of my life because I know what they're capable of. And now they're crossing lines they shouldn't. They just want to meet their grandson," she insisted. "Is that so bad?" I didn't respond immediately. Of course, it sounded harmless in theory, but I couldn't forget what they had done. My sister hadn't lived through the same experience as me. To her, they had always been loving and understanding parents. She wasn't the one who had been left alone, who had to survive without support, who had been ignored for 7 years. "You won't understand," I said finally, "but I ask you not to give them any information about me or about my son." "All right," she responded, though her tone didn't entirely convince me. "Just think about what I said." I hung up with a sense of unease. If my sister had really given them my email, what else could she tell them in the future? The next few days were relatively quiet, but my anxiety didn't go away. I made sure to check all my privacy settings and warn the school about any possible attempt at contact from my parents. It seemed like I was prepared for anything. Until one day, when I went to pick up my son from school, I saw him, my father. He was standing a few meters from the entrance, hands in his pockets, watching the children leave. My heart started pounding. I couldn't believe he had the audacity to show up there. I quickly approached my son and took his hand, not taking my eyes off my father. When he realized I had seen him, he raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I just want to talk," he said in a calm voice. "Not here," I replied coldly. "Not in front of my son. Please, don't make this harder than it already is." I ignored his plea and started walking away with my son. I wasn't going to fall into his game. But when we reached the car, I felt my son tug at my hand. "Mommy? Who was that man?" I swallowed hard. I wasn't ready for this conversation. "Just someone I know," I answered evasively. My son frowned but didn't ask anything else. However, I knew this wasn't the end. My parents were escalating the situation, and if I didn't find a solution soon, I feared what they might do next. After that unexpected encounter with my father at my son's school, I couldn't sleep well for several nights. My mind was filled with questions, worries, and fear. I couldn't allow this to continue, but I also couldn't help but wonder how far they were willing to go. The first thing I did was contact the school administration again to reinforce security. I asked them, under no circumstances, to allow any unknown person to speak with my son. I also gave them a photo of my parents so they could be on alert. Fortunately, they understood the situation and promised to act with caution. However, the problem didn't end there. Just 2 days later, I received a call from an unknown number. My instinct told me not to answer, but the persistence made me give in. "Hello? Please, don't hang up. It's your father." The sound of his voice made me clench my teeth. My first reaction was to hang up immediately, but I forced myself to listen. "I just want to talk," he said, his tone almost pleading. "I don't want to fight. I don't want to argue. I just want to understand." "Understand what?" I asked coldly. "Why I don't want you back in my child's life after abandoning me?" "There's nothing to understand, Dad. I know we made mistakes." His voice sounded broken. "But please, let us make amends." I closed my eyes, trying to contain my anger. Make amends? 7 years of abandonment can't be fixed with a few nice words. "You can't make amends for anything," I responded. Life went on without you. I went on without you. And my son doesn't need grandparents who ignored him for 7 years. We didn't ignore him. He tried to justify. Yes, you did, I interrupted. You knew he existed, and you chose to pretend he didn't. And now, just because it's convenient for you, you want to come back. No, I won't allow it. The silence on the other end of the line felt heavy. For a few seconds, I thought the call had ended, but then his voice returned. All right, he said in a more serious tone. If that's how you want it to be, I accept it. But I want you to know something. We won't give up. And with those words, he hung up. I stayed there, holding the phone, feeling a chill run down my spine. His words weren't a plea. They were a warning. The following days were tense. I didn't see my parents at the school again, but my paranoia grew with every small incident. I noticed cars parked near my house more often than usual. Sometimes, I felt like someone was watching me at the supermarket. And the worst part came when my son, in his innocence, told me something that froze me. Mommy, a man talked to me when I left school. My body tensed immediately. What man? I asked, trying to stay calm. I don't know, he answered, shrugging. He said he was your friend and wanted to say hi, but the teacher took me away quickly, so I couldn't talk to him. My heart pounded. I could feel fury and fear mixing inside me. Sweetheart, if someone you don't know tries to talk to you, what do? Don't talk to them and look for a trusted adult, my son repeated as if it were a mantra. I hugged him tightly, feeling powerless. This couldn't go on. I decided to contact my lawyer again. This time, I wanted to know what I could legally do to prevent my parents from approaching my son. I explained the situation, and he advised me to request a restraining order. It wasn't easy, especially since, so far, I only had suspicions and not solid proof of harassment, but I made sure to gather anything that could be useful. Meanwhile, my sister kept insisting that I was overreacting. Look, I understand that you're upset, she told me in one of our conversations. But don't you think you're taking this too far? They haven't done anything except try to talk to you. It's not just that, I replied, frustrated. They are approaching my son without my permission. What's next? That they try to take him without me knowing. Don't be ridiculous, she scoffed. They wouldn't do something like that. Are you sure? Because I'm not sure about anything anymore. My sister didn't understand, or she didn't want to understand, and that hurt me, but I didn't have time to convince her. My priority was my son. One night, while working on my computer after my son had fallen asleep, I received a notification of a new email. My heart stopped for a second when I saw the sender. My mother again. This time, the subject of the email said something that chilled me to the bone. We cannot be ignored forever. I didn't open the email. I didn't want to read it. Instead, I saved it as evidence and prepared for what was coming next. Because something told me this was only just beginning. After receiving that veiled threat in the email, I knew the situation was escalating in a way I could no longer ignore. My parents were no longer just a painful memory from the past and now. They were a real danger to my child's safety and my own peace of mind. I couldn't keep waiting to see what they would do next. I had to act. The next morning, I went straight to the police station to report the harassment. I presented the emails, the recorded calls, and the school reports about their attempts to contact my son. The officer who attended to me listened patiently and took note of everything, but his expression made it clear that he didn't see the urgency of the situation. I understand your concern, Mom, he finally said, but for now, what we have here are attempts at communication. There are no direct threats or evidence that they intend to harm you or your son. No threats, I repeated incredulously. Then what does "we cannot be ignored forever" mean? The officer sighed. We can take this as a warning and proceed with a restraining order if you manage to obtain more concrete evidence. But for now, the only thing we can do is recommend that you reinforce your security and stay alert for any physical contact attempts. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was a start. I left the station with a knot in my stomach, feeling powerless. My priority was protecting my son, but if the law couldn't help me yet, I had to find other solutions. Over the following days, I made sure to reinforce security measures. I installed cameras around my house, alerted my neighbors about the situation, and spoke again with my son's school to ensure that no unauthorized person could approach him. I also seriously started considering the idea of moving, but I knew it wouldn't be easy to do overnight. Meanwhile, my parents' attempts to contact me didn't stop. They kept sending emails, each one more persistent than the last. In one of them, my mother wrote, "We don't want to make this harder than it already is. We only want what's best for our grandson. You don't realize it, but you are taking away an important part of his family. He deserves to know us. He deserves to know who we are." I didn't respond. I wasn't going to fall for their emotional manipulation. But what really disturbed me was another message I received the next day, this time from an unknown number. "We know you're scared. It doesn't have to be this way. All we want is to talk. Let us see the boy, and all of this will be resolved. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be." I immediately blocked the number and saved the message as evidence. This was no longer just harassment. They were now trying to intimidate me. This wasn't a simple plea for reconciliation. It was a warning that they would do whatever it took to get what they wanted. Paranoia started affecting every aspect of my life. I felt like I was being watched everywhere. At the supermarket, while going for a run, even when taking my son to the park. I couldn't relax. Any unfamiliar person near my house sent me into a panic. One night, while working on my computer after putting my son to bed, I heard a noise outside. My heart raced. I carefully approached the window and checked the cameras on my phone. There they were, 2 figures near my mailbox. I couldn't see their faces, but something inside me told me it was them. I didn't hesitate. I called the police. "There are people outside my house," I said, my voice trembling. "I think it's my parents. They've been harassing me and I need help immediately." The operator assured me they would send a patrol, but by the time they arrived, the figures were gone. The officers searched the area but found nothing suspicious except for footprints in the dirt near the mailbox. They advised me to stay alert and reinforce security measures. The next day, I checked the camera footage. There was no doubt. It was them. My mother and father standing outside my house in the middle of the night as if they were waiting for something. What did they want to do? Why were they insisting on this? I decided to show the footage to my lawyer and the police. Now I had stronger evidence. With this, I was finally able to start the process of requesting a restraining order. But even with that measure in motion, I knew this wouldn't stop easily. Meanwhile, my sister kept insisting that I was overreacting. "There are parents," she said during a call. "Do you really think they would hurt you?" "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But what I do know is that I'm not going to wait and find out." She sighed. "I don't understand why you can't at least talk to them." "Because I don't want to. Because I don't trust them. And because every time they've had the chance to prove they've really changed, they've done the opposite. Just think about it." "There's nothing to think about." I hung up. I no longer had the energy to keep arguing with her. That night, I received another email. This time, the subject line sent chills down my spine. "We are waiting for you." I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what it meant. The problem was, I had no idea what their next move would be. And that was what scared me the most. After the message, "We are waiting for you," echoed in my mind like an unsettling whisper, I knew fear had already taken root in my life. No matter how much I tried to stay calm, I couldn't ignore the fact that this situation was escalating. The restraining order was in process, but that didn't mean my parents would stop. The next morning, I decided to take a different route when taking my son to school. Every day, I changed paths, trying to avoid any predictable patterns they could track. I didn't want to give them the slightest opportunity to intercept us. But my paranoia kept growing. That afternoon, as I left work, I noticed a car parked outside my office. It wasn't a familiar vehicle, but its presence felt too coincidental. Through the reflection of the window, I saw the driver looking in my direction. A chill ran down my spine. Was it them? Had they hired someone to follow me? I quickened my pace and walked into a nearby cafe. From there, I observed the car. 10 minutes, 15, 20, it was still there. I decided to call the police. "There's a suspicious car outside my workplace," I reported tensely. "I don't know if I'm being followed, but I have a history of harassment from my parents, and I fear for my safety." They asked me to take note of the license plate, but just as I discreetly tried to get a closer look, the car sped off and disappeared into traffic. I was left trembling. I didn't know if I was really being followed or if I was losing my mind. But what I did know was that I couldn't ignore the possibility. That night, I took more serious measures. I called a security company to install a more advanced system at home, motion sensors, alarms, more cameras. I couldn't afford to leave any blind spots. I also contacted my lawyer again. If they keep approaching your house or your son's school, the restraining order will be reinforced, he explained. But as long as there's no attempt at physical harm, the police will act cautiously. So I have to wait until they try to kidnap my son for them to take stronger action? I asked in frustration. I know, and I understand how terrifying this is for you. But for now, keep gathering evidence and stay vigilant. If you receive another message or notice someone following you again, notify me immediately. Things seemed to calm down for a couple of days, but that peace was just an illusion. One afternoon, when I went to pick up my son from school, the principal called me into her office. I need to talk to you about an incident today, she said seriously. My heart skipped a beat. What happened? I asked immediately. The principal sighed and pulled out her phone. She showed me images from the school security cameras. My mother was there, standing outside the school, watching as the children left. My son hadn't noticed her, but she was there, lurking. We asked her to leave, but she came back a few minutes later. The school security escorted her off the premises, but we thought you should know. My hands trembled with rage. This wasn't just an attempt at contact. This was direct harassment. I'm going to use this as evidence for the restraining order, I said, my voice tense. And I want the school to strengthen security to make sure she can't come back. The principal nodded. We will. We'll also coordinate with the local police to ensure they patrol the area more frequently. That night, I talked to my son. Honey, I need you to listen to me carefully, I said as we ate dinner. If someone you don't know approaches you and says they know me, that they're part of our family, or that they want to take you somewhere, what will you do? Find a trusted adult, he answered immediately. And what if that person says they're your grandma or grandpa? My son frowned. But I don't know them. Exactly, I nodded. So if someone you don't know tries to talk to you or take you somewhere, don't go. Run and get help, okay? Okay, mommy, he answered firmly. I felt a lump in my throat. I didn't want my son to grow up in fear, but I also couldn't ignore reality. Days passed, and while there were no more physical appearances from my parents, the emails kept coming. More persistent, more desperate, until one arrived that turned my fear into pure panic. We know where you live. We know where your nanny works. We know which park you go to on Saturdays. Don't ignore us. I ran to shut all the windows and check the security cameras. I felt like I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just a threat. This was a declaration of war. I called the police immediately. They've crossed the line, I said, my voice breaking. I need protection for me and my son right now. The officer on the other end of the line didn't hesitate. We're on our way. As I waited for the patrol to arrive, I realized I'd reached the point of no return. This wasn't going to stop on its own. My parents weren't going to give up. And if I didn't do something drastic soon, I feared the worst. I looked at my son, oblivious to the chaos consuming me, and I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't keep waiting. I couldn't let this escalate any further. But what else could I do? I didn't have the answer yet, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to give up. Not now. The sound of sirens grew closer as I held the phone with trembling hands. The thread in the email still echoed in my mind. We know where you live. We know where your nanny works. We know which park you go to on Saturdays. They had crossed the line. This was no longer just harassment or attempts at emotional manipulation. This was a warning that they were willing to go further. When the patrol arrived, 2 officers quickly got out of the vehicle. I showed them the printed email and the security camera recordings. They took notes on everything and assured me that they would patrol the area more frequently. The restraining order should be approved within the next few hours, one of the officers informed me. With this new evidence, we might be able to push for more severe intervention if they try to approach you again. And what if they try something before it's in effect? I asked, my voice breaking. If you see them near your house, the school, or your workplace, call us immediately. Don't hesitate to report it. We're taking this seriously. I nodded, but the anxiety didn't go away. I knew they wouldn't stop that easily. That night, my son slept peacefully while I checked the locks on the doors and windows over and over again. Every shadow outside made me jump. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the fear consumed me. The next morning, I decided that I couldn't go on like this. This had to end once and for all. I contacted my lawyer and the authorities to explore the possibility of filing more serious charges. They explained that, while the harassment and threats were alarming, The lack of physical contact made it difficult to take immediate drastic action. However, they assured me that if my parents attempted to approach again, they would have a stronger case for an arrest warrant. Meanwhile, my sister called me. "Mom and Dad are saying you're slandering them," she said, sounding exhausted, "that you're painting them as monsters when all they want is to be part of their grandson's life. If they really just wanted that, they wouldn't have abandoned me 7 years ago," I responded without hesitation. "They wouldn't have sent threats. They wouldn't be stalking me at my son's school, my home, my workplace." "You're still exaggerating," she insisted. "If you would just talk to them." "There's nothing to talk about. I've made my decision, and if they try to come near us again, they'll pay for it legally." I hung up. There was no point in trying to explain something she refused to understand. I didn't have to wait long for things to escalate. 3 days later, I received a call from the school. My mother had tried to pick up my son. She said she was his grandmother and that she had permission, the principal explained. But when we checked, we realized it was a lie. We called the police immediately. My heart pounded. They were trying to take him. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was an attempted kidnapping. I went straight to the police station. My mother was already there, accompanied by my father. Both of them were furious. "We just wanted to see him." My mother screamed when she saw me. "You're cruel. You've stolen 7 years of his life from us." The officers separated us before I could respond. It didn't matter what they said. What they had done was more than enough for the restraining order to be approved immediately. And with their attempt to take my son, the authorities finally took serious action. I pressed charges against them for harassment and attempted kidnapping. My parents tried to defend themselves, claiming they only wanted to make up for lost time, but there was no justifying what they had done. The judge wasted no time in granting a permanent restraining order. My parents would no longer be allowed to come near me or my son under any circumstances. If they tried again, they would face prison time. Over time, the fear began to fade. Not immediately, but little by little, I was able to breathe freely again. I moved to another city with my son, changed jobs, and cut all ties with my family. My sister tried to reach out to me again, but I made it clear that if she continued defending our parents, she had no place in my life. My son grew up without knowing them, without even remembering their faces. And when, years later, he asked me about them, I told him the truth in the most gentle way possible. "Sometimes family isn't the people who gave you life," I told him, "but the ones who love and protect you unconditionally." He hugged me, and in that moment, I knew I had made the right decision. There was no space for the past in our lives, only for the future. And in that future, it was just him and me, safe at last.